So, Dr. John Campbell has been at it again, sharing misinformation and exaggerated claims, generally speaking, about hantavirus that are just not true. And the thousands of comments that he's getting mostly reflect that people believe it, not necessarily him per se, but believe in the whole conspiratorial aspect of it. And it just goes to show neither he, who is not a doctor, he has no microbiological, virological, or infection control experience. He's a former A&E nurse and a nurse lecturer. Doesn't mean he's not knowledgeable, of course not. Us nurses would be nowhere without nurse lecturers. You know, that is part and parcel of our training and our ongoing education. But he is not a specialist in any of the areas that require contextualizing this particular situation. He's basically taking what he sees on the media or hears on the media, in the media, and regurgitating it. And so many people are buying it. So for this rebuttals episode of In Plain Sight, I thought it was important to use it as a good example of why nuance matters in outbreak communication, because there are just parts of a discussion that are parts of a discussion that are reasonable and cautious, but there's also many points where he's speculating and it drifts beyond what the evidence actually supports, and he's sharing this information, as are others, and it's creating anxiety and fear where it doesn't need to exist, because that is not the truth. Now, to be fair, first, he repeatedly says it's unlikely to become a major outbreak, that wider community spread isn't currently expected, and that transmissibility appears low. And this is, generally speaking, it aligns with current public health assessments and personal knowledge of how hantavirus works. It has between a 40 and 50% mortality rate. So it can't become a pandemic because the mortality rate's too high. The mortality rate was between 1 and 3% on average for COVID. Therefore, it very easily became a pandemic. But something that has a higher mortality rate is unlikely to ever become a pandemic because it kills off the host organism before it can spread enough to cause a pandemic. That's why Ebola could never become a pandemic, because 14 days max, and you're in end stage of the disease, the infection. So it is unlikely to become a pandemic because the virus doesn't work that way. Can you say with 100% certainty it won't? No. What in life is 100% certain apart from death and taxes? And even the death one's a bit negligible if you read some science articles. But it's highly, highly, highly unlikely. But when you listen to it further, several of his conclusions go way beyond the available evidence. And I'm saying this as someone who has 20 plus years in infection control and attends regular UK SHA meetings for regular updates. And his data is woefully out of date. Now, one reoccurring theme is that one individual may have led to multiple infections upon the ship. And he somehow suggests that this suggests Omicron levels spread of an R value of 9. That's not true and completely misleading. You cannot meaningfully compare a tiny cluster on a confined ship with the population level spread dynamics of COVID variants circulating globally. You just can't do it. The math doesn't add. The math doesn't math. Ships are highly unusual environments epidemiologically. Think about it. Prolonged indoor exposure, repeated close contact, shared ventilation, communal dining, social mixing, limited isolation opportunities, delayed recognition of illness, and so on and so on. And we've seen intense outbreaks of all sorts of infections on cruise ships, norovirus, influenza, COVID, for exactly those reasons. A confined cluster in those circumstances does not mean the virus behaves similarly in the wider community. Just doesn't. Now, another major issue is the repeated implication he makes that transmission aboard the vessel was almost certainly airborne, because investigators found no evidence of kissing, sexual contact, or bed sharing between the passengers involved. The absence of evidence for intimate contact is not evidence of airborne spread. Transmission aboard a ship could plausibly involve prolonged close proximity, shared indoor spaces, shared air reclamation, contaminated environments, respiratory secretions at short range, caregiver contact, or just social interaction repeatedly, which is what happens on a cruise ship. Public health investigators just asked about kissing, bed sharing, household exposure, bodily fluids, and so on during outbreaks because you're trying to narrow the exposure pathways. The standard routine questioning. It is not out of the norm for this situation. It's standard routine questioning because narrowing the exposure pathways allows you to eliminate possible causes of spread, but not because the only possible routes are close contact spread. That's not the reason at all. And importantly, neither the ECDC or any other public health authorities have concluded that this outbreak demonstrates efficient airborne transmission. There is no evidence as we're having this conversation. At present, the Andes hantavirus person-to-person spread is considered uncommon and associated mainly with close or prolonged contact, i.e. being on a cruise ship. The repeated references to pre-symptomatic spread need context as well, because limited transmission before symptom onset has been reported previously with the Andes virus is very different from the kind of widespread asymptomatic transmission from a respiratory virus that drove the COVID pandemic. They are not equivalent epidemiological situations. It's also important to avoid overstating what increasing case numbers mean. Throughout the discussion, he repeatedly makes the implication that more cases equals the virus is more transmissible than we thought. That's crap. More cases in a confined outbreak just reflects long incubation period, delayed symptom onset, multiple close contact exposures, and the very nature of the ship environment. It doesn't mean the virus has changed its behavior at all. And that is where the discussion becomes problematic towards the end, as it does with so many of his and others. The suggestion that we should hope there's been no genetic manipulation because Moderna began vaccine research into hantaviruses in 2024, he subtly introduces suspicion without any evidence whatsoever. Vaccine and antiviral research into dangerous zoonotic viruses is completely normal. It is not new. It's been going on for decades. That is how we get vaccines for viruses. Scientists actively study pathogens like hantavirus, avian influenza, Nipah, Ebola, SARS like coronavirus, hemorrhagic viral fevers, etc. Precisely because the preparedness work has to be put in to predict an outbreak that may occur. Of course it does. It's common sense. You never want to close the door after the proverbial horse has bolted. The existence of prior vaccine research is not evidence at all of engineering or foreknowledge or manipulation. It's evidence that scientists identified potentially dangerous pathogens and are attempting to prepare for future risks. And it matters because even speculative wording can shape audience perception. Saying, let's hope it was just epidemic curiosity may sound casual, but it can unintentionally reinforce conspiratorial thinking, despite there being no evidence at all that this outbreak was engineered or manipulated. Another point worth clarifying is mortality versus transmissibility. Symptomatic Andes hantavirus infections does, as I mentioned at the beginning, have a significant mortality rate, and that absolutely makes it clinical serious. Of course it does. But severity and transmissibility are not the same thing. A virus can be highly dangerous, poorly transmissible, relatively mild, but extremely transmissible and spread to a lot of people in a short space of time. At present, the evidence still suggests Andes hantavirus falls much closer to the former than the latter. And ultimately, it's important to have balance and that we maintain balance in this very anxiety-created post-COVID world. We should absolutely monitor unusual outbreaks, investigate transmission patterns, remain open to changing evidence, and avoid dismissing concerns prematurely. Absolutely, of course. But we have to avoid turning uncertainty itself into evidence for worst-case scenarios. And we absolutely have to avoid doing it for monetization, because that is the only reason that him and other grifters share this information the way they do, is to scare people and to monetize it. That is the only reason. They are not doing it to be altruistic. They believe it with their whole chest that it's true. I hope they believe it, even though it's incorrect. Because if they don't, that's even worse. But It is not true. And these people are not scientists. They are not medical professionals. They are not infection control experts. They are not microbiologists. They are not virologists. They're not public health people. They don't work for the CDC. They don't. They are purely using scare tactics to monetize their videos. Right now, the evidence does not show a COVID-like airborne virus, sustained community spread, Omicron level transmission, evidence of genetic manipulation. Do you know what it does show? A serious but relatively contained cluster, given that it was on a cruise ship, complicated by a long incubation period, which it has. It occurred in a uniquely high contact environment, which it did. And there's ongoing surveillance and contact tracing underway, which is made more difficult because people have disembarked the ship before they knew there was a problem, because it has a minimum of 40 to 50 days incubation period. So people had left the ship before they even knew there was an issue. That's not conspiracy. That's just the way it works. So the most evidence-based position at present is this: stay alert, stay evidence-led, avoid complacency, but equally avoid jumping from we still have unanswered questions to this may be the beginning of the next pandemic. They are not the same thing. And as always, the truth and understanding of balance is always hiding in plain sight.